Before I tell you anything else, I need to say this plainly. The names you're going to hear are not the names the people were given at baptism. They are names chosen later, names assigned so that you can follow the story without getting lost, and so that the people who lived it can keep what little privacy they still have. The details that matter are intact. The identities are not. I'm going to call the mother Tanya. I'm going to call her son Evan. I'm going to call the nurse Marisol. I'm going to call the local priest, Father Michael Kavanaugh, and I'm going to call the landlord, Daryl. That is the first courtesy I can offer them. The second is this: I will not tell you this the way movies tell it. I'm not interested in making you jump. I'm interested in helping you understand how certain cases begin quietly, almost embarrassingly ordinary, and how a person of faith is supposed to proceed when something does not fit. Because that is how this began, with something that did not fit. I remember the weather first, because weather is often what people remember when they call in distress. Not the theology, not the vocabulary, the weather. In the file I later reviewed, the first note referenced a storm system still dumping rain across southern Louisiana. If you've ever driven there after a major storm, you know the air feels heavy, like it can't decide whether it's water or breath. You smell wet wood, gasoline, and that sour, low-lying mold that comes up when drywall has been soaked and then hurriedly painted over. Tanya's call did not come to me directly. I want to be clear about that. I did not pick up a phone at 2 in the morning and rush to a bayou house with a stole around my neck. That is not how this case reached me. It came to me the way many cases do, through a chain of responsible people who did the right things in the right order. It reached me later in a folder with signatures and dates in a careful tone that told me the priest who wrote it was not trying to impress anyone. But I can still hear Tanya's voice in my head because the priest included a transcript of the initial conversation as best as he could reconstruct it, and he followed up with both mother and nurse. He wanted the human reality, not just the check boxes. She was calling from a gas station. That detail matters too. People don't call from gas stations unless they have nowhere else to be. A gas station means light, a counter, a public place where you can pretend everything is fine for the length of a transaction. It means you can stand under fluorescent bulbs and not feel alone. The priest noted that she apologized 3 times before she even explained why she called. That's common. People apologize because they fear being judged more than they fear what is happening. They think the moment they describe it out loud, they'll sound ridiculous. She said, "Father, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I don't know who else to call." And he asked her very calmly where she was, who she was with, and whether anyone was in immediate danger. He did not ask her if she'd been dabbling in anything. He did not ask her what she thought it was. He asked the right questions first. She told him she was standing by a pump, rain coming in sideways, her son in the passenger seat of an older sedan that smelled like wet upholstery. She'd pulled off because the boy started gagging again. She said his face went red, his eyes watered, and he kept swallowing like something was stuck in his throat. The priest, Father Kavanaugh, asked her the simplest question of all: has he been seen by a doctor? And she said yes. She said she had been in and out of urgent care since the storm, since they moved. She said she felt like she was becoming the kind of mother nurses dread, the kind who keeps showing up with a child who looks fine in the waiting room. Then she said the sentence that made Father Kavanaugh sit up: "It only happens when we pray." I want you to hear that the way a responsible priest hears it, not as proof, not as a headline, as a data point. Because people can connect symptoms to prayer for many reasons. Anxiety can do that. Trauma can do that. A child can learn that when a parent prays, it's because something is wrong, and the body responds before the mind can explain. A child can develop a strange habit, a physical tic, a reflexive gag, and it can attach itself to a ritual. None of that requires anything preternatural, but it requires attention, it requires patience, it requires humility. Father Kavanaugh asked her what she meant by only when we pray. Was it during church? Was it at home? Was it any prayer? Was it a specific prayer? Was it at the beginning, the middle, the end? She said, it's at the end. He asked, at the end of what? She said, at the end of everything. And then, after another apology, she said it plainly. He can't say amen. That was her phrase. Not he doesn't want to, not he refuses, not he makes a face. She said he can't. If you work with families long enough, you learn to listen for that distinction. Parents know the difference between defiance and fear. They know the difference between a child being stubborn and a child being trapped. Father Kavanaugh asked her to describe exactly what happened. She told him the boy could pray the Our Father with them. He could say the Hail Mary. He could repeat after her. He could even laugh and joke before they started. But as soon as the prayer approached the last word, always the last word, something would change in him. She said it was like watching a hand tighten around his throat. She said he would jerk his chin down, his shoulders would tense, and his voice would thin out, like a radio losing signal. He would open his mouth, try to force the word out, and then gag, dry heave, sometimes vomit bile, even when he hadn't eaten much. He would clutch at his neck like a child who thinks he is choking. And then, once the prayer ended, once she gave up, once she stopped trying, he would recover. Not slowly, quickly, like a switch had been flipped. If you're a parent listening to that, you might already feel the panic in your chest, because it doesn't just sound unpleasant, it sounds targeted. It sounds like something with an intention. But as a priest, you don't build conclusions out of sound, you build them out of careful steps. Father Kavanaugh asked her what the doctors said. She told him they did what doctors do. They listened to his lungs. They checked his oxygen. They looked for swollen tonsils, reflux, allergies, postnasal drip. They asked about asthma. They asked about new foods, new detergents, mold exposure, especially after the storm. They did a basic throat exam. The notes later indicated no obvious obstruction, no infection that would explain an episodic gag reflex that came and went so cleanly. One physician wrote a line that stood out to me when I read it later. Symptom reported only during prayer. Patient otherwise appropriate, playful, no respiratory distress. That line is neither an endorsement nor a dismissal. It's a clinician saying this is real to them and it doesn't match the usual patterns. Father Kavanaugh then did what every priest should do before he ever prays in a way that could intensify fear. He grounded her. He told her, I'm glad you brought him to medical professionals. Keep doing that. Do not stop doing that. I'm not going to tell you this is spiritual without ruling out what can be ruled out. And then he said something else that was both pastoral and practical. He told her to stop forcing the child to say the word. That's important. A child in distress does not need a parent turning prayer into a test. He told her to pray quietly, to pray in her own heart. And if the child joined in, fine. If not, fine. He told her, God is not keeping score against your son. Tanya started crying, according to the transcript. Not the dramatic kind of crying, the exhausted kind. The kind that comes when someone finally tells you you're not failing at motherhood because you can't fix what you can't explain. Then she told him why they were in that town at all. They had lost housing after the storm. Not entirely, sometimes lost means water damage, a landlord who won't repair, an insurance issue that becomes a slow motion eviction. She didn't talk like someone trying to win sympathy. She talked like someone who had rehearsed the explanation because she'd had to give it at counters and offices and clinics all week long. They had found a cheap rental. Too cheap, she admitted, but they didn't have options. The neighborhood sounded like one of those places where beauty and decay sit on the same block. Old trees, older homes, ironwork fences, and then, tucked behind that charm, a kind of neglect you can smell. Father Kavanaugh asked her if there was anything else strange in the house. She hesitated. That matters too. People who want attention don't hesitate. People who are scared of being called crazy hesitate. She said the boy didn't like his room. She said he refused to sleep with the closet door open. She said he insisted on a nightlight even though he hadn't needed one before. And she said quietly that sometimes he would wake up and say, "Mom, don't make me say it. Make me say it." When a child phrases it that way, you have to consider that for him, the word amen isn't a conclusion. It's a doorway. It's the moment something happens. Whether that something is panic, memory, suggestion, or something darker is not for a phone call to decide, but it is for a priest to take seriously. Father Kavanaugh asked her who the landlord was and whether the landlord had disclosed any history of the property. She gave a name, Daryl, and said he was helpful in the way a person can be helpful when they want you to sign quickly. She said he took cash for the deposit. She said he shrugged off her questions about water damage. He said the house was old, that's all. Old doesn't mean evil, old means old. But old also means people lived there before you, people suffered there before you, people sinned there before you, and sometimes the residue of human choices doesn't stay politely in the past. Father Kavanaugh did not tell her any of that on the phone. He did not feed her imagination. That's not his job. He told her he wanted to meet in person, and he wanted to do it in the daylight if possible. He told her to bring any medical paperwork she had. He told her, again, not to force the child. He told her to keep the child hydrated, to keep the environment as calm as she could, and to call emergency services if the boy showed signs of true choking or breathing difficulty. And then he asked to speak to Evan directly. The transcript describes the boy's voice as small but polite. The kind of child who has learned to be agreeable because he senses his mother is hanging by a thread. Father Kavanaugh asked him what happens when he tries to say the last word. There was a pause, and then the boy said, "It laughs." That was the first time the file moved for me from unusual into pay attention, because it laughs is not a medical description, it's an experience. Father Kavanaugh did not ask, "What is it?" He did not ask, "Is it a demon?" He asked, "Where do you hear the laughing?" And the boy said, "Right here." And then, according to Tanya, he tapped his throat. A child pointing to the throat could mean he feels tightness. It could mean reflux. It could mean a psychosomatic reaction. But it could also mean something else, that the point of attack is not the whole prayer, not the idea of God, not church in general, but the closing what the church understands as a consent, a sealing, an agreement. Amen is not a magic word. It's not an incantation, but it is a declaration. It means, so be it. It means I agree. It means I place my trust here. If you wanted to disrupt a person's relationship with God without making a spectacle, you would not necessarily smash statues. You would not need floating furniture. You would simply turn the act of trusting into an act of fear. You would teach a child that the moment he says yes, something bad follows. Again, I'm not saying that was the case. I'm saying that is the logic a priest has to consider when the pattern is consistent. Father Kavanaugh ended the call the way a good priest ends a call like this, with something simple, not dramatic. He told Tanya he would meet them. He told Evan he was not in trouble. He told the mother and the boy that God hears even the prayers we cannot finish out loud. And then, after he hung up, he made a note in the file that is almost painfully understated. Phenomenon appears linked to prayer conclusion, proceed with caution, continue medical evaluation, schedule pastoral meeting. That's it. No theatrics, no certainty, no claim of authority over something he had not yet seen. But if you read between the lines, you can feel it. The quiet recognition that something here did not fit cleanly into one category. And in cases like this, that is where the danger begins, not because the devil is hiding behind every shadow, but because fear is eager to fill the gaps where clarity should be. The next day, Tanya would bring the boy in, the nurse would enter the story, the house would enter the story, and a name written in someone else's handwriting, tucked away in a place a child shouldn't have to sleep, would begin to surface. But at this point, all we had was a storm-soaked town, a mother at a gas pump under harsh light, and a child who could say every holy word except the one that ends them. And that single missing word was enough to make a responsible priest do what he did next. He chose to look closer, slowly, carefully, and without feeding the darkness with attention it had not yet earned. When Father Kavanaugh agreed to meet them, he did something else that doesn't look dramatic on paper, but it tells you a lot about the kind of priest he was. He called the parish office first, not to announce an emergency, not to gather a crowd. He simply made sure he wouldn't be alone. A priest who has any training at all knows this. If you're going to step into a situation that could be emotionally volatile, you make sure there are witnesses. You make sure there is order. You make sure you can document what happens without embellishment. That protects the family, and it protects the church, and it even protects the priest from his own imagination. So he arranged to meet them the next day in daylight at the parish before he ever set foot in their rental. That detail matters because daylight changes everything. In the daytime, a frightened person can still be frightened, but they have fewer places to hide their fear behind shadows. And if something truly abnormal is happening, it doesn't need darkness to perform. Tanya arrived early because anxious people arrive early. She came in with that stiff posture you see in parents who haven't slept, shoulders up, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the room as if the building itself might judge her. Evan walked close to her side, not clinging in a childish way, more like he was trying to be responsible for her, which is its own kind of sadness. He looked, in every ordinary sense, like a healthy boy. Clean clothes that didn't quite match, hair combed by a mother rushing in the morning, sneakers scuffed at the toes. He made eye contact. He answered questions. He didn't present like someone in crisis. And that's where families start to doubt themselves. They sit in an office with a calm priest and everything looks normal, and they think, maybe I'm making this up. Maybe I'm tired. Maybe it's stress. Maybe it's the storm. Maybe I've turned my own child into a problem because I'm afraid. Father Kavanaugh, to his credit, didn't let them spiral. He offered water. He spoke to Evan first, not in an interrogative way, but in the way you speak to a child to remind him he's a person, not a case file. He asked him about school, about what he liked to eat, about what games he played. He asked him what he missed about their old place. He asked him what he liked about the new house. Evan answered the first questions without any trouble. But when Father Kavanaugh asked about the house, the boy's eyes slid away. His mouth pressed into a line. And then he said very quietly, I don't like my room. Not I'm scared, not it's haunted, just I don't like my room. Tanya looked down at her hands the way adults do when they're ashamed of something they can't control. Father Kavanaugh asked her to tell the story of the move. Not the spiritual story, the practical one. And Tanya did. After the storm, their previous place wasn't livable. She didn't say it with drama. She said it with the flat tone of someone who's already explained it to insurance people, to a landlord, to a nurse at a clinic. Water had gotten in. The walls smelled wrong. The air made Evan cough at night. Their money was tight, and the storm didn't make it less tight. So they looked for a rental. Everyone was looking for a rental. Prices went up, options went down. People were desperate in the way people get desperate when they're trying to keep a child out of the back seat of a car. And then Daryl showed up. That's how she phrased it. He showed up. He wasn't a friend. He wasn't a savior. He was a man who knew what scarcity does to people. He had a house. It was old. It was cheap compared to everything else. He asked for a deposit in a way that made it clear he didn't want paperwork slowing him down. He said there had been some water, but it was fine now. He said the neighborhood was good. He said the house just needed a family in it. Tanya admitted she didn't ask enough questions. She admitted she didn't have the luxury of asking enough questions. That's another thing people don't like to hear, but it's true. Desperation makes you sign things you would never sign in peace. Father Kavanaugh listened without judgment. Then he asked about prayer. How did they pray as a family? Was it a habit before the storm or something they had started after? Tanya said they had always prayed, but after the storm it became more frequent, more urgent. They prayed before meals. They prayed at bedtime. They prayed in the car, not because they were trying to be holy heroes, but because praying was the only thing that still felt like a structure when everything else had been knocked loose. And it was during those prayers that the problem became impossible to ignore. Not at first, she said. At first, Evan just hesitated at the end, like a kid who forgets a line. She corrected him gently. She thought it was cute. Then the hesitation turned into a refusal. Not a tantrum, more like his whole body would stiffen when the last word approached. He would shake his head before anyone even asked him to say it, like he was begging her not to. Then it became physical. The file describes it in practical terms: gag reflex, throat tightness, facial flushing, watery eyes, dry heaving. It notes the mother's report that the child could speak normally afterward, with no lingering hoarseness, no fever, no signs of infection. But the file also includes something you only get when a priest listens, like a priest. It includes the mother's description of the way the room felt when it happened. She said the air would feel thick. She said the sound of the house would change, the creaks, the pops, the settling noises of old wood would seem to come closer, as if the house itself leaned in to listen. She said Evan would glance toward the closet, not like a kid checking for a monster, but like someone checking a door to see if it was locked. And she said this: the moment she stopped insisting, the moment she let the prayer end without that last word, Evan would exhale like a swimmer breaking the surface. As she talked, Father Kavanaugh watched the boy, not with suspicion, with care. He watched for the little cues, the way Evan swallowed when the topic came up, the way his fingers picked at a thread on his sleeve, the way his foot tapped the floor in a steady rhythm, trying to self-soothe. Then Father Kavanaugh did something that, again, is not flashy, but is correct. He asked Tanya for permission to pray a simple prayer in the office, not a ritual, not anything that would frighten a child, just a brief prayer asking God for peace and protection. And he asked Evan if that was okay. This is important. Authority in the church is real, but it is not supposed to be used like a hammer, especially with a child. Consent matters. Gentleness matters. Prudence matters. Evan hesitated, then nodded. Father Kavanaugh began quietly, not in Latin, not loudly. He used the kind of voice you would use if a child had a headache. He prayed for Tanya's strength. He prayed for Evan's health. He thanked God for the doctors and nurses. He asked for wisdom to know what was natural and what was not. And then, as he moved toward ending, he paused. He didn't force Evan to do anything. He didn't even include the word that was triggering the problem. He simply said, "Lord, grant us your peace." And Evan's shoulders tightened anyway. Do you hear what I'm saying? The priest didn't say the word. The mother didn't say the word. The boy didn't say the word. But the moment the prayer moved toward closure, toward that internal sense of ending, Evan's body reacted as if something had grabbed him. He swallowed hard. His face went pale, then flushed. His eyes watered. His mouth opened slightly, and his throat made that dry, involuntary sound children make right before they gag. Father Kavanaugh stopped immediately, not because he was afraid, because he was responsible. He ended the prayer without pushing further, and he shifted the focus back to calm. He told Evan, "You did good. You're okay. You're not in trouble." And then he did what a good priest does when he's dealing with something that could be spiritual or psychological or both. He widened the circle. He asked Tanya about medications, about mold, about coughing at night, about stress. He asked whether Evan had seen anything frightening online. He asked whether Evan had heard adults arguing about money, about the storm, about being homeless. He asked whether anyone had threatened Evan with God as a punishment. He asked whether any relatives had tried to scare him straight with talk of demons. Tanya answered as honestly as a tired mother can. She said she didn't let Evan watch horror movies. She said she was careful about what he saw. She said there was stress. Of course there was stress, but Evan had always been steady. She said he didn't have nightmares before the move. She said the fear began in that house. Then Father Kavanaugh asked to visit the house. not for a performance, not for an exorcism, for observation. He told Tanya he would come with another adult present. He asked if a family member or friend could also be there. He asked for a time when Evan was normally calm, not overtired. He told her to continue medical follow-up. He told her, again, that nothing about this meant her son was bad. He reminded her that fear itself can attach to prayer in complicated ways. And then Tanya said something she hadn't said on the phone. She said she had found something in the house. She hadn't brought it with her. She didn't even want to touch it. But she told him there was a notebook hidden in the closet of Evan's room, tucked behind something like it had been put there and forgotten, or put there and intentionally concealed. Father Kavanaugh asked her not to read it to him over the phone later. He asked her not to show it to Evan. He asked her to keep it somewhere neutral until he could see it. He didn't want it turning into an obsession in the home. You can tell, even from the way the file's written, that Father Kavanaugh was aware of a trap. The trap is this: when people sense something frightening, they begin collecting clues. They begin building a narrative. Every creak becomes a sign. Every coincidence becomes a message. Every bad dream becomes a confirmation. And before long, fear becomes its own kind of ritual, repeated and reinforced. So he did not feed it. He scheduled a visit. The house was not far, just a few miles from the parish, but the atmosphere changed as soon as he pulled onto their street. He noted this later in the file with a kind of reluctant precision. The neighborhood had charm, the kind you see on postcards. Old homes, mature trees, wrought iron, porches that looked like they were built for evenings and conversation. But the storm had left marks. There were warped boards on fences, water lines on brick, the faint smell of dampness that clings long after sunshine returns. Some homes looked cared for, others looked like they had been hurriedly patched. There were piles of debris in corners of yards, the kind people mean to haul away soon, but soon keeps getting pushed back when you're trying to survive. Tanya's rental sat among them like a tired thing, trying to hold itself upright. The porch steps creaked when Father Kavanaugh climbed them. The door stuck before it opened, swollen from humidity. Inside, the air conditioning ran too loud, like it was fighting a losing battle. And the house had that particular scent you learn to recognize if you've ever been in older properties after water intrusion, a mixture of cleaning product, wet wood, and something faintly sweet that shouldn't be sweet. Tanya apologized again as she let him in. She apologized for the mess. She apologized for the smell. She apologized for calling him at all. Father Kavanaugh told her to stop apologizing. He asked where Evan was. Evan was in the living room, sitting close to Marisol. Now, Marisol wasn't part of the plan, at least not originally, but this is how real life works. People reach for the person who made them feel safe. Tanya had ended up in the emergency room enough times that Marisol had seen the pattern, and Marisol, being practical, being grounded, had offered to come by on her day off, partly as a witness and partly because she didn't like the idea of a frightened mother and child alone with their fear. When I read that, I remember feeling gratitude. People think cases like this are only about priests and demons. They forget how often the first line of mercy is a nurse with good instincts and a steady voice. Father Kavanaugh introduced himself to Marisol, asked her what she had observed medically, and she gave him a calm report. She described the boy's vitals during episodes: elevated heart rate, visible distress, but no prolonged oxygen issues. She described the way the episode resolved quickly when the trigger stopped. She described the pattern, always near the end of prayer. Then Father Kavanaugh asked Tanya to show him Evan's room. Tanya hesitated at the doorway. That's another detail I don't skip over. Adults hesitate at doorways when they're afraid of what their child has been facing alone. That hesitation is a form of guilt. Evan stayed in the living room. Father Kavanaugh did not bring him into the room yet. He didn't want to make the room a stage. The room was small, typical for an older home. A twin bed against one wall, a dresser with a few drawers that didn't quite close, a window that rattled when the air conditioner kicked on, a closet door that looked slightly misaligned, like it had been taken off and put back on more than once. There were toys, but fewer than you'd expect for a boy his age. Not because Tanya was neglectful, because when a family is displaced, possessions become optional. Father Kavanaugh stood quietly in the center of the room and did what trained clergy do in situations like this. He did not start talking, he listened. Old houses make noise, they settle, they creak, pipes knock, wind finds cracks. But there is a difference between normal noise and a room that feels like it's holding its breath. He didn't say that out loud to Tanya. He just asked her softly where the notebook was. Tanya pointed to the closet, and at that moment, according to the file, Evan called out from the living room without seeing what they were doing. Don't open it. Not yelling, not panicked, just a flat, urgent warning, like a child telling you not to touch a hot stove. Father Kavanaugh closed his eyes for a brief second, not in drama, but in prayer. Then he told Tanya to remain behind him, and he opened the closet door. Inside were a few hanging shirts, a box of donated clothes, and, pushed back behind the box, a thin notebook with a worn cover. He didn't open it yet. He brought it out, held it like evidence, and walked it into the living room where Evan could see it from a distance. Evan's face changed immediately. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, then unclenched, like he was trying to keep his body from doing what it wanted to do. Marisol watched him with the sharp attention of someone who has seen trauma reactions before. Father Kavanaugh placed the notebook on the coffee table, left it closed, and sat down at a respectful distance from the child. He asked Evan a simple question. Have you read this? Evan shook his head quickly, too quickly. Tanya whispered that she had read parts of it. She said she shouldn't have, but she did. She said it made her feel sick, like she was swallowing someone else's fear. Father Kavanaugh did not scold her. He asked her what she remembered, and this is where the story began to tilt, slowly, into something darker, not with a scream, not with a crash, but with ink on paper. Tanya said the notebook had scripture passages underlined, not random passages, passages about vows, about truth, about what happens when people twist holy things for selfish reasons. There were notes in the margins. Some were prayers. Some were more like warnings. And there was a name written more than once, the same way a person writes a name when they're trying to convince themselves it's real. A name like a knot pulled tight. Father Kavanaugh asked her what name. Tanya swallowed, glanced at Evan, and then said it. Malfa's knot. The moment the name left her mouth, Evan made the sound he'd made in the office, that dry, involuntary gag like his body was reacting before his mind could decide. Father Kavanaugh raised his hand slightly, not as a threat, but as a signal to pause. He told Tanya, firmly but gently, not to repeat it again in front of Evan. He told Marisol to keep watching the boy's breathing. And then he looked at the notebook on the table, still closed, like it was something that could poison a room without ever being opened. He didn't open it yet because he understood something that too many people forget. Names matter, not because they are magic, but because they shape attention. And attention, especially fearful attention, can become a kind of invitation. So he didn't give it more room than it deserved. Instead, he asked Tanya to tell him about Daryl again, about the lease, about what he said, about what he didn't say. And as she described the landlord's easy smile, his quick hands, the way he acted like time was always short, Father Kavanaugh's face remained calm, but his questions grew more precise. Because the notebook was one thing, a child's reaction to prayer was another. But a landlord who rushes a desperate family into a house after a storm without answering basic questions that suggested a human layer to the story, a layer that often comes first. When Father Kavanaugh finally opened the notebook, he did it quietly, with no flourish, like a man reading an unpleasant report. And what he saw in those first lines was enough to make him do something he had not done so far. He asked Tanya to step out of the living room with him for a moment, away from Evan's hearing, and he told her in a low voice that they were going to proceed carefully. He was not going to label her son. He was not going to terrify her with certainty, but he was also not going to pretend that a consistent pattern like this, prayer ending, throat locking, fear clustering around one room, and a written obsession hidden in a child's closet was something to wave away with a smile. He told her there would be steps. Medical steps would continue. Pastoral steps would begin. And if they did pray, they would pray in a way that did not turn Evan into a battlefield. He ended that first visit without fireworks. He did not bless the house dramatically. He did not sprinkle holy water like a weapon. He simply prayed quietly for peace. And he intentionally did not bring the prayer to the kind of ending that had been harming the boy. Then he closed the notebook, placed it in a plain bag, and told Tanya he would keep it for now, not because it was powerful, because it was harmful. And as he stepped back onto the porch with storm-wet air pressing against his skin, he made one more note for the file, something that would prove important later. He wrote that, for the first time, he was beginning to suspect the problem was not merely that Evan could not say a word. It was that something or someone had taught Evan to fear what that word meant. And that kind of fear doesn't grow in a vacuum. It grows where truth has been withheld, where desperation has been exploited, and where something hidden has been allowed to remain hidden. That is where the next part of this case truly begins. After that first visit, the house didn't suddenly become quiet. It didn't behave because a priest had walked through the doorway. And Tanya didn't suddenly feel brave because someone in a collar had taken her seriously. What happened instead was more realistic and, in a way, more exhausting. Life continued. The same damp heat sat on the neighborhood. The same tired air conditioner rattled in the window like it was one hard day away from quitting. The same smell of old wood and cleaner rose from the floors every morning when Tanya mopped, as if she could scrub anxiety out of the grain. Evan still had to eat breakfast. Tanya still had to figure out work, school forms, laundry, groceries, rides, money. Displacement doesn't pause because a spiritual question enters the room. If anything, it gets louder because now every normal stress has a shadow next to it. Father Kavanaugh had told her not to force the word. He told her to stop turning prayer into a cliff. Evan had to jump off every night. He told her very clearly that God does not demand a child choke to prove faith. So Tanya tried. She tried praying silently. She tried praying while Evan colored at the table so it felt less like a ceremony and more like background. She tried praying in the kitchen while she washed dishes, the kind of prayer that doesn't announce itself. Sometimes she would hear Evan whisper along under his breath, and her heart would lift for half a second until she realized he always faded out before the end, like a song cut short. And then, because she was a mother, she slipped. One night, without thinking, she said the last word herself, gently, as if giving him permission to stop fighting. She said it the way you might finish a child's sentence when you know they're tired. The reaction was immediate. Evan wasn't even the one saying it. But the moment the prayer closed, he jerked as if someone had tugged a wire inside his throat. His hands flew to his neck, his face flushed, his eyes watered. He gagged hard, the kind that makes your stomach twist, even if you're watching from across the room. He looked at Tanya with something like betrayal, not anger, fear, like she had stepped on a landmine he had been trying to warn her about. Afterward, he wouldn't sleep. He lay on the couch with the television on low, staring without seeing, and when Tanya asked him what he was afraid of, he said, "It thinks you're trying to make me. It thinks." A child's grammar tells you what his mind is doing. He wasn't describing a vague feeling. He was describing an agent, an intention. Whether that agent was a formed imagination, a trauma response, or something preternatural was still not something Father Kavanaugh would label quickly, but it was something he couldn't ignore. That's why the next step Father Kavanaugh took was not to return with a stole and holy water like a man walking into a battle. He returned with questions, with boundaries, and with help. He called Marisol, not because he needed medical authority to confirm a demon. That's not how this works. But because Marisol had seen the episodes in a clinical setting and she had a steady mind. She wasn't impressed by religious drama, and she wasn't threatened by religious language. She was the kind of person who could look at a frightened child and a frightened mother and say calmly, "Tell me exactly what happened. Don't skip anything. Don't guess." Father Kavanaugh also spoke with Tanya about continuing medical evaluation, especially after a storm. Mold exposure, reflux triggered by stress, allergies, postnasal drip, all of it. He encouraged her to follow up, even if the visits felt humiliating. He told her the church does not ask families to abandon medicine. The church asks families to pursue truth. Tanya did follow up. The file notes another clinic visit, another basic examination, another nothing abnormal found, another line about symptoms tied to prayer. And as the medical avenues continued, Father Kavanaugh began what he called pastoral observation. He didn't frame it as an exorcism. He didn't even frame it as deliverance at first. He framed it as what it was: prayer for peace, for protection, for clarity, and for the child's freedom from fear. But he did something crucial. He moved the locus of prayer away from Evan's bedroom. He told Tanya that, for now, Evan's room needed to be a place of rest, not a place where fear was rehearsed. He told her not to discuss the notebook in that room, not to argue in that room, not to pray in that room. He wanted to break the association. He also asked her something that, to her, felt almost irrelevant at the time. He asked her how she had gotten the house, not the address, the process. What exactly did Daryl say? How did he present himself? What did he leave out? How quickly did he push for signatures? What did he do if she asked questions? Because Father Kavanaugh understood something I have seen again and again. The spiritual does not float in the air like fog. It often hooks into something very human: a lie, a betrayal, a sin that someone wants to keep buried, an exploitation that someone wants to call business. When Tanya described Daryl again, his friendliness that never reached his eyes, his habit of standing too close, his insistence that lots of people are asking about this place, Father Kavanaugh made a decision. He would speak to the landlord, not to accuse him of anything, not to threaten him with religion, but to gather truth. He called Daryl and asked if they could meet at the house. Daryl agreed with the kind of confidence people have when they think they're untouchable. People like that often assume a priest will be easy to dismiss. They think the caller means you won't confront them directly. Daryl arrived late, as if arriving on time would have signaled respect. He walked through the front door with a smile that didn't match the tension in the room. He made a joke about the storm. He made a joke about old houses making noises. He looked at Evan and said something like, "Hey, champ," as if the child was just being dramatic. Father Kavanaugh didn't react. He didn't lecture. He didn't take the bait. He asked Daryl simple questions. How long had Daryl owned the property? Had there been recent renovations? Any known water damage beyond the storm? Any previous tenants complain of mold, wiring issues, structural instability? And then the question that matters most in cases like this: had there been any significant incidents in the house before? Daryl's smile thinned. He shrugged and said, "It's an old place. People come and go." Father Kavanaugh asked again, more specifically: fires, deaths, police calls, anything that would be relevant to a family with a child. Daryl laughed lightly and said something like, "Father, you're not trying to tell me this kid is seeing ghosts, are you?" The file notes that Evan began to swallow hard as Daryl spoke, not because Daryl used any particular word, but because the tone in the room shifted. A child can feel when an adult is lying. Even if he can't explain it, the body registers it as danger. Marisol watched Daryl, and later she wrote a short note that was included in the folder I reviewed. It wasn't a medical note. It was an observation. She wrote that Daryl kept glancing toward the hallway that led to Evan's room, not like someone checking on a child, like someone checking on a locked drawer. Father Kavanaugh noticed it too. He didn't follow Daryl's eyes yet. He stayed in the living room, on neutral ground, and he asked Daryl if he had ever found anything left behind by previous tenants. Not furniture, not trash, writings. Daryl's head turned too quickly. He said, "Like what?" Father Kavanaugh said, "Like a notebook. Daryl's smile disappeared entirely for the first time. And that, for me, is one of the most important moments in the entire case, not because it proves anything mystical, but because it reveals something human. People don't react that way to something they've never heard of. Daryl said he didn't know what Father Kavanaugh was talking about. He said tenants leave junk behind all the time. He said he wasn't responsible for people's weird stuff. He told Tanya with a sudden edge that if she was trying to get out of the lease, she needed to read the contract. Tanya flushed with anger and shame at the same time. She started to speak, then stopped. She looked at Father Kavanaugh as if asking permission to defend herself. Father Kavanaugh raised a hand not to silence her, but to slow everything down. He told Daryl he wasn't there to negotiate a lease. He was there because the child was having distress that seemed connected to the home environment, and as a priest, he had a responsibility to make sure a family wasn't being harmed by something preventable. He asked Daryl one last time, had there been a death in the house? Daryl's jaw clenched. He stared at Father Kavanaugh for a long second, then forced a laugh again, but it sounded thinner now. He said, "People die everywhere, Father." That's a true sentence used as a shield. Father Kavanaugh didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He ended the conversation politely, because in that moment he had learned what he needed to learn. Daryl was not a cooperative witness, and Daryl was invested in keeping something vague. After Daryl left, the house felt different, not because Daryl carried demons on his shoulders, because lies have an atmosphere, lies make a room feel tight, lies make a child's fear make sense. Evan, who had been quiet the entire time, suddenly whispered to Marisol when Daryl's car door slammed outside. "He knows." Marisol asked, "He knows what, honey?" Evan shook his head hard, then pressed his hand to his throat. "He knows the end." The end. A child describing theology without the words for it. Father Kavanaugh didn't respond with a dramatic conclusion. He took Evan's statement and placed it next to all the other data points. The pattern at the end of prayer, the notebook hidden in the closet, the landlord's defensive reaction, the child's fear clustered around closure, consent, completion. And then Father Kavanaugh did what priests rarely get credit for doing. He set limits. He told Tanya that for now, they would not attempt any prayer that pressured Evan into finishing anything aloud. They would focus on peace. They would focus on sleep. They would focus on removing fear from the child's daily routine. He told her he would consult with his diocesan contacts and follow the protocols the church expects. He told her he would document everything, and he would not move faster than prudence allowed. He also asked Tanya something that made her stare at him like he'd read her mind. He asked her whether, during the worst of the storm and the search for housing, she had ever made a desperate promise. Not a formal vow, not a dramatic bargain, just a sentence spoken into the air when you're out of options. A sentence like, "I'll do anything," or "Anyone please," or "I don't care how, just help." Tanya's eyes filled immediately. She said, "I didn't mean it like that." And Father Kavanaugh said, "I know. But the enemy doesn't care how you meant it. The enemy cares what fear can twist." That line stayed with me when I read it later, because it reflects something very old in spiritual theology. Evil does not need your sincere consent to harm you. It needs your weakness, your exhaustion, your isolation. It needs a moment where your words outrun your wisdom. Tanya confessed right there in the living room that on the first night after the storm, when they were sleeping in the car, she had prayed in a way she was ashamed of. She had whispered, "God, I'll take any roof. I don't care who helps, just give my boy a place to sleep." She said she felt it was wrong the moment she said it, not because she didn't need help, but because she had surrendered discernment out of panic. Father Kavanaugh didn't shame her. He told her that desperation is not a sin, but desperation can open doors if we let it turn us careless. Marisol, listening, crossed her good arm over her chest because even though she was not a theologian, she understood the psychological truth embedded in that. When you tell yourself anything, anyone, you train your mind to accept what you should question. You stop asking whether something is safe because you're so relieved it's available. Evan stared at Tanya during that confession, and in the file it notes that his breathing changed. Not worse, easier. Like a knot inside him loosened when his mother spoke the truth out loud. That was a clue too, because fear thrives in secrecy. And whatever was happening to Evan, natural or preternatural, was being reinforced by what remained unspoken. Father Kavanaugh ended that evening with a prayer that did not chase a climax. He prayed for Tanya's forgiveness of herself. He prayed for Evan's freedom from fear. He prayed for the house to be nothing more than wood and nails and walls. He prayed for the grace to see clearly. And he ended the prayer without forcing a conclusion that would trigger the child. He simply stopped. He let the prayer rest, unfinished in form, but not unfinished in God's hearing. When he left, he told Tanya the next step would be simple. He would return again in daylight. He would bring another priest or a trained witness. He would continue documentation. He would review the notebook in a controlled setting away from Evan. He would not treat a child like a stage. And he told her one more thing. Quietly, the way you tell a parent something you want them to remember when fear starts rising at 2 a.m. He said, if something is feeding on attention, don't feed it. If something is feeding on silence, don't give it silence. We will not panic, and we will not pretend. That night, Tanya tried to sleep. Evan finally drifted off on the couch with Marisol still in the house, a steady presence like a lamp left on in a storm. And just before Tanya closed her own eyes, Evan whispered something that was added to the file later because she repeated it word for word. He said, "Mom, it's waiting for the end." That was all. Not a scream, not a threat, a sentence that sounded like a child describing a game, except there was no play in it at all. And when I read those words much later, in a different place, in a quiet office far from Louisiana rain, I understood exactly why Father Kavanaugh wrote what he wrote next. He wrote that the case was no longer simply about a child's gag reflex. It was about a pattern and intelligence, perhaps not in the Hollywood sense, but in the sense that something consistent was choosing the same point again and again. The end. The seal, the moment a prayer becomes an act of trust. And that is where the next stage of discernment truly begins. Father Kavanaugh did not treat that sentence, "It's waiting for the end," as a verdict. He treated it as a signal. The next morning, he did what careful priests do when a situation starts forming a pattern. He documented, he consulted, and he kept the family from being pulled into the worst mistake people make in fear, improvisation. He called Tanya early, not to stir her up, but to anchor her. He asked how Evan slept. He asked if there had been any true breathing distress, any fever, any choking episodes outside prayer. He asked if Evan had eaten. He asked if the boy had complained of pain or just fear. Tanya said Evan slept in pieces, waking and shifting, but he slept. She said he was tired and quiet, like a child trying to conserve energy. She said he had breakfast. She said there had been no gagging, not once, until she started to pray silently while washing a cup. She hadn't said anything out loud. She hadn't even meant to make it a prayer. It was just a habit, a murmured line under her breath, asking God to help her get through the day. And still, Evan looked up from the table and pressed his hand to his throat. The body recognized the pattern even when the mind tried to disguise it. Father Kavanaugh didn't argue with her interpretation. He didn't say, "Well, maybe he heard you." He simply told her, again, not to blame herself and not to test it. He told her to keep the day as normal as possible. He told her to avoid any conversation about the notebook in Evan's hearing. He told her to keep his room as neutral as she could, no cleaning sprees in the closet, no searching for signs, no late-night pacing that would teach Evan the house was dangerous. Then he did something Tanya didn't see, and Evan would never know. He contacted his diocesan office and asked for guidance on procedure, because priests do not operate alone on matters like this, not if they're honest. He described the situation carefully. Child, consistent physical response. At prayer closure, no medical findings so far. Notebook left behind by previous occupant with obsessive content. Landlord evasive. He requested permission to proceed with prayers of deliverance in a controlled manner if the pattern continued. He also asked for a second cleric to be present, someone trained enough to be a witness without turning the room into theater. And then he asked Marisol to be there again, not because he needed her to fight anything, because he needed someone whose mind remained clearer under stress, someone who would notice details and remember them accurately, someone who would stop him if emotion began to lead. A good nurse is a gift in cases like this, because nurses are trained to care without fantasizing. That afternoon, Father Kavanaugh sat down with a notebook in a quiet office at the parish, away from Tanya's home, away from Evan's ears, away from the charged air of that bedroom closet. He didn't open it like a man unwrapping a curse. He opened it like a man reviewing a troubling journal entry. The pages were not ornate, no strange symbols drawn in blood, no dramatic sketches, just handwriting. And that, in some ways, is always the most sobering part. Because handwriting means a person sat somewhere with a pen in hand and made choices. The first pages were scripture passages, underlined and re-underlined, as if the writer was trying to pin the words down so they wouldn't slip away. Passages about truth, about oaths, about letting your yes be yes. Passages about the danger of twisting holy things for selfish ends, the kind of passages a troubled person might cling to if they felt their life had been built on a lie. Then the tone shifted. There were notes in the margins that didn't read like prayer anymore. They read like someone trying to name an experience that wouldn't stay in one category. There were repeated references to the end, not as a death, but as a closing, the last word, the seal, the point where a person commits. And there, written again and again, was the same name Tanya had spoken in the living room, Malthus Not. Father Kavanaugh did not take that name and declare it official. He did not treat it like a title out of a manual. He treated it like what it most likely was, the label someone in distress had placed on a pattern they couldn't break. But he also didn't dismiss it, because the notebook contained something else that was harder to explain away as mere imagination. It contained a consistent method. The writer described feeling fine through most of a prayer and then choking at the end. The writer described hearing a sound, sometimes laughter, sometimes a tightening silence, right when they tried to say the final word. The writer described making bargains in desperation, not formal bargains, but those quiet bargains people make when they're alone and frightened. Just make it stop and I'll do anything. The writer was not claiming to see horns in the corner of the room. The writer was describing what I would call a spiritual pressure point, the place where fear tries to turn faith into suffocation. One entry stood out, not because it was supernatural, but because it was human and ugly. The writer mentioned a man who kept the truth locked up because the truth would ruin the deal. Father Kavanaugh read that line twice, then closed the notebook and sat in silence for a long time. A priest is trained to recognize when something in writing lines up too neatly with something in life, not because it proves a demon, but because it suggests a story underneath the story. If the notebook was left in that closet, it likely wasn't left by accident. It was left by someone who couldn't outrun what they were experiencing, someone who wanted to warn or wanted to burden the next person, or someone who wanted to keep a record because they were afraid they'd be told they were crazy. Either way, it connected the present to a past that was still unnamed. So Father Kavanaugh did a second kind of investigation. Again, not dramatic, practical. He asked about the property history through the channels available to him. He asked parishioners quietly if they knew the house, if they knew the owner, if there had ever been talk about an incident there. He didn't spread rumors. He didn't announce a haunted house. He asked the way a pastor asks when he's trying to protect a family. And one older woman, someone who had lived through more storms than anyone should, said something that matched the direction the case had already been moving. She said, "That place had a death a long time ago, and it wasn't peaceful." People said it in different ways. Some said a man took his own life. Some said he was found hanging. Some said it had to do with religion. No one offered details at first because people don't like to stir old wounds. But the outline was there. And the outline mattered because evil rarely appears out of nowhere. It often nests where grief and secrecy have been allowed to rot into something else. When Father Kavanaugh returned to Tanya's house 2 days later, he brought the second cleric he'd arranged in Marisol as planned. It was still daylight, late afternoon, the sun low enough to throw long shadows, but not low enough to make the rooms feel like caves. Tanya greeted them at the door with the strained politeness of someone trying to look stable for her child. Evan was sitting on the living room floor with a stack of cards, building something that looked like a house and a tower at the same time. His hands were steady, his face was calm. If you walked in without context, you would think, normal kid, normal home, normal day. That's why these cases are so difficult. They hide inside normality. Father Kavanaugh did not begin with prayer. He began with questions for Evan that had nothing to do with religion. He asked what Evan had eaten. He asked if he'd slept. He asked if he'd been outside. He asked if there was anything in the house that scared him besides his room. Evan shrugged at first. Then, without anyone prompting him, he said, "It doesn't like when you stop." Not it doesn't like when you pray. When you stop, that was new. Father Kavanaugh asked him what he meant. Evan looked toward the hallway, then back at Father Kavanaugh, like he was checking whether he was allowed to say it. He said, "It wants you to keep going, and then when you stop, it gets mad." A child explaining what he feels, that the danger isn't the prayer itself, it's the moment of ending, the moment of closure, the moment of finality. Father Kavanaugh didn't turn that into a speech. He nodded slowly and said, "Thank you for telling me." Then he asked Tanya privately whether Evan had said anything new in the last couple days. Tanya hesitated, then admitted that Evan had started asking strange questions at bedtime. Questions like, "If I don't finish, does God still hear it?" Questions like, "If you finish, will it know?" Questions like, "Can you finish for me without saying it?" The child was trying to engineer a way around the cliff. Father Kavanaugh told Tanya he learned a bit more about the house's history. He didn't give her gossip. He gave her what he considered relevant. There had been a death, and it had been treated with silence instead of truth. Tanya's face tightened with anger. She said Daryl never told her anything. She said he never warned her. She said he took her desperation and turned it into profit. And Father Kavanaugh said something that in the file is recorded almost word for word because Marisol later repeated it. He said, "That is where we begin, not with a demon, with a lie." He explained briefly, not as a lecture, that spiritual harm often rides on moral harm. When a man hides a death to keep a rental filled, he isn't summoning anything, but he is creating conditions where fear, deception, and vulnerability gather in one place. Then he established ground rules. No one was to provoke Evan. No one was to pressure him. No one was to test whether saying the last word would trigger the reaction. No one was to repeat the name from the notebook in front of him again. They would pray simply. They would pray briefly. They would stop if Evan showed distress. And they would document everything with sobriety, not excitement. Marisol stood near the couch, arms still tender from her earlier injury, her posture attentive but not alarmed. The other cleric remained quiet, ready to witness, not to perform. Father Kavanaugh asked Evan if he wanted to stay in the room or go sit in the kitchen with Tanya. Evan surprised everyone by saying he wanted to stay, not because he was brave, because he was tired of being afraid alone. Father Kavanaugh began with a prayer that any Catholic would recognize as ordinary. He asked God for peace. He asked for protection. He asked that what was not of God would have no claim on that child. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. He prayed like a father, speaking calmly in a hospital room. For most of the prayer, Evan was fine. You could almost feel Tanya's hope trying to rise. And then, as Father Kavanaugh's cadence naturally moved toward conclusion, Evan stiffened. It wasn't theatrical. It was immediate and physical, like someone pulling a string that ran from his throat to his spine. His shoulders rose, his chin tucked, his fingers pressed into the soft spot at the base of his neck as if to hold something back. Father Kavanaugh stopped before the prayer reached any formal ending. He did not say amen. He did not even reach the kind of tone that signals closure. He stopped mid-thought, the way you would stop if you saw a child about to fall downstairs. Evan swallowed hard, gagged once, then steadied, and in that moment, something became clearer. The trigger was not the word itself as a sound. The trigger was the act of ending. Father Kavanaugh looked at Evan and said, "You're okay. You're safe." Evan blinked rapidly, fighting tears not from pain, but from frustration. He said, "See, it does that." Father Kavanaugh didn't deny him. He didn't contradict his experience. He said, "I see it happening to you. That's real." Then he did something that, again, seems small, but it was one of the most important moves in the case. He asked Evan to breathe with him, not to pray, to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, steady. Evan followed. His shoulders lowered. The redness in his face eased. And Father Kavanaugh said, "Nothing gets to decide when you can breathe." That line in the file is underlined because whether the cause was psychological or spiritual, the message was the same. The child's body was not property. Then Father Kavanaugh turned to Tanya and said, very quietly, "We're going to speak to Daryl again." Tanya's eyes widened. She didn't want confrontation. She wanted relief. Father Kavanaugh said, "We need truth. If a lie is part of this, we remove the lie." So they called Daryl on speaker with Tanya's consent in the living room while Evan sat close to Marisol. Daryl answered with a clipped tone, as if being interrupted was an insult. Father Kavanaugh told him, calmly, that there was a family with a child experiencing distress connected to prayer and connected to that home, and that Father Kavanaugh had reason to believe Daryl had withheld relevant history of the property. Daryl laughed and said, "Are you serious right now?" Father Kavanaugh did not argue about tone. He asked a direct question, had there been a hanging in that house? There was a pause, not long, but long enough. Then Daryl said, "People say all kinds of things." Father Kavanaugh asked again, and this time he narrowed it further. Did Daryl know, yes or no, that someone died by hanging there, and did he choose not to disclose it? Daryl's voice sharpened. He said something about that was years ago, about it's not legally required, about you can't blame me for a kid's issues. And then, in the middle of Daryl's defensiveness, Evan made a sound, not a gag, a whisper. He leaned toward the phone, eyes wide, and said, "Stop tying it." Tanya froze. Marisol's gaze flicked from Evan to Father Kavanaugh. Father Kavanaugh didn't react outwardly. He kept his voice level. He asked Daryl what Evan meant by tying it. Daryl snapped, "I don't know what you people are talking about." And then he said a sentence that sounded like a man stepping on his own words. He said, "That notebook isn't even supposed to be there." That sentence landed in the room like a dropped tool in a quiet church, because you can't say that notebook if you don't know there is a notebook. Tanya's face went pale. Father Kavanaugh didn't raise his voice. He didn't pounce. He simply said, "So you do know about it." Daryl stammered, then recovered into anger, the way guilty people do when they realize they've revealed too much. He said he was coming over. He said this was harassment. He said he was going to handle it. Father Kavanaugh ended the call without argument. He looked at Tanya and said, "We are not going to be alone with him." He told Marisol to stay. He told the other cleric to remain. He told Tanya to keep Evan in the living room, away from the hallway. And then he did something that speaks volumes about his understanding of both human danger and spiritual danger. He moved the notebook, still in its plain bag, out of sight, not because it was a magical object, because Daryl had just told them, without meaning to, that he felt ownership over it. A few minutes later, Daryl's car pulled up hard in front of the house. You could hear the engine rev, then cut. You could hear a door slam. You could hear his footsteps on the porch, heavier than they needed to be. He knocked once, then tried the handle as if the door should open for him because he owned the deed. Tanya looked ready to crumble. Evan pressed closer to Marisol, one hand at his throat. Father Kavanaugh opened the door enough to speak, not enough to invite. Darrell stood there with his smile gone, face flushed, rain sweat shining on his forehead. His eyes darted immediately toward the hallway, again, like a man searching for something he thought was hidden from him. Father Kavanaugh stepped outside onto the porch and closed the door behind him. He kept the confrontation out of the living room, out of Evan's ears, out of the space where fear could feed. Darrell started talking fast about contracts, about property rights, about crazy religious people. He demanded the notebook. He said it was private. He said it belonged to someone else. He said it was not for you. Father Kavanaugh asked him one question quietly. Why do you want it so badly? Darrell's mouth opened, then closed. He said, because it's mine to deal with. Father Kavanaugh said, then deal with it honestly. Tell this mother what happened in this house. Darrell's jaw worked like he was chewing rage. And then, almost against his will, he said it half confession, half spite. He said there had been a man who rented that house before. A religious man, Darrell said, or someone who thought he was. A man who got obsessive, who wrote things down, who couldn't stop praying, who went nuts. Darrell said the man was found hanging. He said the police called it suicide. He said people blamed religion because the man had been too intense. And then Darrell said the part that mattered most. He said he didn't tell Tanya because you can't rent a place if people start talking. That is the kind of sentence that opens a door all by itself. Not a supernatural door, a moral one. Father Kavanaugh did not threaten him. He did not curse him. He simply told Darrell that what he had done was wrong and that he had put a child at risk by withholding truth. Darrell scoffed and stepped toward the door as if he could push past Father Kavanaugh and search the house. And that's when something happened that the file describes with careful restraint. The porch board beneath Darrell's foot cracked loud, sharp, and Darrell jerked back as if the wood had bitten him. He swore. He looked down. He looked up at Father Kavanaugh with a flash of fear he tried to hide immediately. Not fear of the board, fear of the timing, because right then, from inside the house, Evan gagged once hard, without anyone praying, without anyone speaking, without any ritual at all. Just the stress of Darrell's presence, the pressure rising toward confrontation, the sense of something closing in on an end. Father Kavanaugh held Darrell's gaze and said softly, "Do you see what your silence has done?" Darrell's face twisted. He tried to laugh, but it came out wrong. Then he demanded the notebook again. Father Kavanaugh told him no. Darrell stepped closer, voice rising, threatening to call the police, threatening eviction, threatening lawsuits, anything to regain control. Father Kavanaugh didn't match his volume. He said, "Leave now. We will speak through proper channels." Darrell leaned toward the door, and Father Kavanaugh, still calm, shifted his stance just enough to block him without putting hands on him. Darrell's eyes flicked again toward the hallway, then back to Father Kavanaugh. And in a low voice, almost as if he couldn't stop himself, he said, "It doesn't let you finish, does it?" Father Kavanaugh didn't answer that question, because it wasn't a question a priest answers on a porch in a moment like that. But he heard it. He heard the implication. Darrell knew more than he was admitting. Whether he knew it as a rumor, an experience, or a fear he'd buried under money, he knew. And as Darrell finally stomped off the porch, muttering curses that weren't theological but were ugly enough, Father Kavanaugh stood there and watched his car peel away. He didn't look triumphant. He looked burdened, because now the case had taken another step forward, and it wasn't the kind of step you want. A notebook tied to a previous tenant, a death kept quiet for profit, a child reacting not only to prayer, but to the very pressure of closure, and a landlord who had just revealed in fragments that he understood the pattern well enough to name it without being taught. When Father Kavanaugh went back inside, he didn't tell Tanya every word Darrell said. He didn't want to feed her fear. He told her one thing. He said, "We are going to do this the right way." He looked at Evan, still holding his throat, and he said, "You are not alone in this." Evan whispered, barely audible, "He tied it." Father Kavanaugh nodded once, slow, as if agreeing not with the child's theory, but with a reality he could no longer ignore. And he said, then we will untie it, not with force, with truth, and with God's peace. That was the moment the file marks as the turning point. Not because the demon finally showed its face, because the lie finally showed its teeth. And from there, the next stage would not be a spectacle. It would be a deliberate, careful confrontation with what had been hidden inside that house, inside that notebook, and inside the words people speak when they are desperate enough to stop choosing wisely. And in cases like this, that is when things often push back, not loudly at first, but just enough to make you want to stop before you reach the end. After Daryl drove away, the house did not feel victorious. It felt exposed. There's a difference. When truth comes into a room where a lie has been living for years, the air doesn't immediately lighten. Sometimes it tightens first. Sometimes the lie fights to keep its shape because lies are sustained by habit, and habit does not release its grip politely. Tanya sat at the edge of the couch with both hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. Her eyes kept moving, doorway to hallway, hallway to kitchen, kitchen back to the front window, as if she expected Daryl to return with someone else, or as if the house itself might produce him again like a bad thought you can't dismiss. Marisol stayed where she was, steady and close to Evan, not hovering, just present. The second cleric said very little, as he should. A witness is not there to add drama. A witness is there to keep the room honest. Father Kavanaugh did not start blessing walls. He did not turn the moment into a ritual. He knew what had happened on that porch was already a kind of pressure on the family. He didn't need to add spiritual pressure on top of emotional pressure. So he did something that sounds almost too small to matter. He had everyone sit down. He told Tanya to take a breath, and he told Evan to take a breath, and he told Marisol and the other cleric to do the same. He wanted the room to remember that breathing was still possible, that fear did not own the air. Then he said calmly, we're going to take the next step, and we're going to take it the way the church expects. That phrase matters. The church expects order because disorder is a tool fear uses. The church expects patience because panic makes you reckless. The church expects documentation because memory becomes unreliable when you're terrified. Father Kavanaugh explained to Tanya that what they would do next was not an exorcism, not at this stage. He was careful with words because words carry weight, and weight can crush a family already carrying too much. He said they would pray prayers of protection and deliverance in a controlled way. He said they would do it with witnesses present. He said they would stop immediately if Evan showed signs of genuine physical danger. He said they would continue medical follow-up because ignoring medicine is not faith, it's arrogance. Tanya nodded, but her eyes looked empty. She was hearing him, but her mind was already racing ahead to the moment when Evan would gag again and she would feel like she was watching her child drown on dry land. Father Kavanaugh noticed that, and he shifted. He spoke directly to Evan. He said, I'm not going to make you finish anything today. Evan's shoulders lowered slightly, as if his body had been bracing for an order he couldn't obey. Father Kavanaugh said, I'm going to pray. You can listen. You can draw. You can sit with Marisol. You can do nothing at all. You are not trapped. Evan stared at him, studying his face the way children study adults when they've been disappointed by too many promises. Then he gave a small nod. And that's when Father Kavanaugh asked the question that moved the case forward in a way that wasn't mystical at all. He asked Tanya, do you want to stay in this house? Tanya blinked, as if the question hadn't occurred to her as a possibility. Then her eyes filled. She said, where would we go? There it was again, the storm shadow. Not just water and wind, but scarcity. The kind of scarcity that makes you accept what you should refuse. Father Kavanaugh didn't offer money. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. But he told her he would speak to the parish to see what resources might exist. He told her he would speak to the diocese. He told her, you shouldn't have to choose between a roof and your child's peace. And in that moment, something changed in Tanya's expression. Not relief, permission, Permission to admit that the house was not simply old or creaky or a little weird. Permission to admit that the place felt like it was pressing itself onto their lives, like dampness that won't dry. That evening, Father Kavanaugh left the family with practical instructions. No testing, no repeating the name from the notebook, no arguing with Daryl. If Daryl returned, do not open the door. Call the police if necessary. Call the parish. Do not face him alone. He reminded her, the most dangerous thing in the house might not be spiritual at all. It might be a furious man who believes control is his right. Before he left, he offered a short prayer again, and he did it in a way that did not approach a formal closing. He prayed for peace, for safety, for rest. He prayed for Tanya's strength. He prayed for Evan's protection. Then he simply stopped speaking and let silence sit in the room without turning that silence into a cliff. When he walked out, the porch boards creaked under his shoes. The air was heavy, the light dull. The neighborhood looked normal, and that normality felt almost insulting. He drove away, and Tanya watched his taillights disappear the way a drowning person watches a boat pull back from shore. Grateful it came at all, afraid it won't return in time. That night was when the case began to press, not with spectacle, with insistence. Evan refused his bedroom entirely. Tanya didn't fight him. She made up the couch again, set a nightlight in the corner, and tried to keep her face calm. Marisol stayed longer than she had planned. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone, pretending to scroll, but really she was listening to the sounds of the house. The house made plenty of sounds, pipes, wood, wind, but underneath those ordinary noises, Tanya kept noticing something else, not a voice, not footsteps, more like a shift in pressure at the moments when the room went quiet. When Evan finally drifted off, Tanya moved carefully, like she was afraid to disturb him. She washed a dish, wiped the counter, tried to occupy her hands so her mind wouldn't run wild, and then without meaning to, she whispered a prayer again. Not a formal prayer, just the line, God, please. Evan jerked awake immediately, as if the words were a hand on his shoulder. He sat up, eyes wide, and pressed his hand to his throat. Tanya froze. She hadn't even realized she'd spoken aloud. Marisol got up and moved to him, calm and slow. She asked, "Where do you feel it?" Evan swallowed hard and said, "It's tight." Marisol asked, "Are you choking?" Evan shook his head, but his breathing was fast. Tanya didn't say another word. She didn't apologize this time. She just stared at her hands like they belonged to someone else. Marisol took Evan's hand and guided his breathing again, in through the nose, out through the mouth. After a minute, the tightness eased. Evan lay back down, still tense, but not gagging. And then he said something that wasn't in the earlier notes, something new. He said, it likes when it scares you. That's how it works, when fear becomes part of the pattern. The fear isn't just a reaction, it becomes a meal. Marisol looked at Tanya, and she didn't speak like a nurse or like a theologian. She spoke like a human being who has seen what terror does to families. She said, very quietly, "We can't let him live like this." The next day, Father Kavanaugh returned with the other cleric again. He brought nothing theatrical. He brought a small bottle of holy water. Yes, because priests are priests, and the church has sacramentals for a reason. But he brought it the way a doctor brings a stethoscope, not as a weapon, as a tool. He also brought paperwork. That might sound strange to you, but it shouldn't. Paperwork is part of prudence. He documented what had happened with Daryl. He documented what Marisol had observed. He documented the specific trigger pattern, closure, ending, the moment of seal. He spoke with Evan again, gently, asking him to describe what he experienced without suggesting vocabulary to him. Evan said it felt like something grabbed the back of his throat and pulled. He said the moment anything ended, even when he was just listening, his body would tighten as if it was bracing for punishment. Father Kavanaugh asked, "What do you think happens if you say the last word?" Evan's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. He said, "It gets inside." That's what fear tells a child. If you complete the prayer, you invite the danger. If you refuse, you anger the danger. Either way, you feel trapped. Father Kavanaugh did not contradict him with a lecture. He didn't say, "That's not how demons work," because a child doesn't need a manual. He needs safety. So Father Kavanaugh said something simpler. He said, "Nothing gets to claim you, not a feeling, not a voice, not a lie." Then he asked Tanya privately if there was anything else she hadn't said, anything she was holding back because she didn't want to sound foolish. Tanya stared at the floor for a long time. Then she admitted that she had started doing something she was ashamed of. She had been avoiding the word amen entirely, even in her own mind. She had been cutting prayers short on purpose. She had been bargaining with silence. She said, "I thought if I didn't end it, it wouldn't happen." That's the trap again. Fear teaches you to keep everything unfinished, unfinished prayers, unfinished conversations, unfinished truth, because ending feels dangerous. Father Kavanaugh told her gently that this was not her fault, but it could not continue. He told her the household had begun reorganizing itself around avoidance, and avoidance becomes a kind of devotion, not to God, to fear. Then he told Tanya and Marisol and the other cleric what he intended to do next. He intended to pray a structured prayer of deliverance, still not an exorcism, but a prayer that would directly ask God to break any spiritual oppression tied to deception, fear, and misplaced vows. But he wanted it done with preparation. He asked Tanya to make the living room as calm as possible. No television, no phones on speaker, no chaos. He asked Evan to be fed and rested. He asked Marisol to be ready to intervene if the child truly began choking. He asked the other cleric to witness and to keep his attention on specifics. And then he said something that, in my experience, is the most difficult part for families. He said, "We will not do this without confronting what is hidden." Tanya asked what he meant. Father Kavanaugh said, "Daryl lied. There was a death here. There is a notebook in your child's closet. There was a previous tenant who left evidence of obsession and fear. And you, in the storm, said words of desperation that you did not mean as a vow, but that fear has tried to twist into one." He said, "We will bring those things into the light, not because confession is a magic trick, because truth is oxygen. And whatever was tightening around Evan's throat, whether it was psychological association, spiritual oppression, or a combination, had been thriving in the stale air of secrecy." Tanya listened, trembling. Then she nodded, very slowly, as if surrendering not to the problem, but to the process. That afternoon, they prepared. Tanya opened curtains to let light in. She cleaned not to scrub evil away, but because cleaning made her feel less helpless. Marisol checked Evan's breathing and posture the way a nurse does when she's trying to determine whether panic is about to tip into physical crisis. Evan sat on the rug with his cards again. He built the same tower, then knocked it down, then built it again, over and over. A child rehearsing endings in a safe way. A child practicing collapse in a way he could control. Father Kavanaugh watched him for a moment, then asked, "Can I sit with you?" Evan nodded without looking up. Father Kavanaugh sat on the floor, because sometimes the most spiritual thing a priest can do is lower himself until a child isn't looking up at authority, but across at a person. He helped Evan build one small structure and then asked him, "When you knock it down, do you stop building forever?" Evan frowned. He said, "No." Father Kavanaugh said, "You can end something and still be safe." Evan swallowed. He whispered, "Not here." Father Kavanaugh didn't argue. He said, "Then we will make it safe." As evening approached, there was a heaviness in the house that no one named out loud. Not a mystical heaviness, but the kind that comes before a difficult conversation when everyone knows you're going to touch a wound that's been covered. Father Kavanaugh asked Tanya to say, in her own words, what she had said during the storm. Not to repeat it like a curse, but to reclaim it, to clarify it. Tanya's voice shook. She said, "I was desperate. I asked for help. I said I would take any roof. I didn't mean I would take evil. I didn't mean I would surrender my child. I meant I needed shelter." Father Kavanaugh nodded. He said, "Good. Say that again clearly." She repeated it, stronger the second time. Marisol watched Evan's breathing as Tanya spoke. And this time, something subtle happened. Evan's shoulders loosened a fraction. He didn't gag. He didn't press his throat. He just listened, as if the truth itself was making room inside him. Then Father Kavanaugh said, "We will pray." He asked Evan if he wanted to stay in the room. Evan hesitated, then nodded. Not bravely, warily, like a child stepping toward a door he has avoided because he's tired of running. Father Kavanaugh began the prayer, quiet, steady, direct. He asked God to break any hold of fear. He asked that any influence not of God would have no place in that home or in that child. He asked that deception would be exposed and that the family would be protected. The other cleric watched, attentive. Marisol kept her eyes on Evan's face and throat, ready to act. For the first minute, Evan remained still. Then, as the prayer moved toward a natural point of closure, not the word itself, but the cadence, the sense of approaching an ending, Evan's body reacted again. His hands clenched, his chin tucked, his throat tightened. But this time, something was different. He did not look at Tanya with betrayal. He looked at Father Kavanaugh as if asking him silently, "Do you see it? Are you going to stop?" Father Kavanaugh did not stop immediately. He slowed. He lowered his voice. And he said, in the middle of the prayer, not at the end, "Evan, you are allowed to breathe." Evan sucked in air sharply, fighting the tightening. Father Kavanaugh said, "You are allowed to stop fighting." Evan's eyes flooded with tears. He gagged once, hard, and then held on. Not because he was stronger than fear, but because someone else was holding the room steady. And in that moment, the house answered in its own quiet way. A light in the corner flickered once, just once. Not a power outage, not a dramatic blackout, just a brief shiver of electricity, like a nervous system reacting. Marisol's gaze snapped to the lamp, then back to Evan. Her face didn't change, but her posture tightened. Father Kavanaugh continued, unwavering, and he did not rush to the end. He kept the prayer in the middle, as if refusing to give fear the satisfaction of a cliff. And I want you to understand what that is. That is a priest refusing to let the enemy set the terms, not by shouting, by refusing to hurry, by refusing to be dragged. Evan's breathing became ragged. His fingers pressed into his throat. His face reddened. And then, from the hallway, there was a sound wood shifting, a low groan as if the house itself had decided to lean its weight toward the room. No one moved to investigate. No one ran, because fear wants you to chase noises. Father Kavanaugh kept praying, slow and steady, and he said words that were aimed not at a theatrical demon, but at a trapped child. He said, "The end of a prayer belongs to God, not to fear." Evan shook his head rapidly, tears spilling now. He whispered, "It's going to." He couldn't finish the sentence. Father Kavanaugh leaned slightly closer, still gentle, and said, "Then we will finish differently." And that was the moment, according to the file, that footsteps sounded on the porch again. Heavy, fast, and Tanya's blood ran cold because she recognized the rhythm of anger. Daryl was back, not because he was invited, because control had been challenged, and he couldn't tolerate it. Father Kavanaugh did not stop the prayer. He did not break the moment to answer the door. He looked at the other cleric and nodded once, a silent instruction. The other cleric stood and moved toward the entryway, not to confront, but to prevent the living room from becoming a battlefield. Daryl knocked hard once, twice, 3 times, then rattled the handle again like the door owed him obedience. Tanya started to stand, panicked. Father Kavanaugh lifted a hand, keeping her seated, keeping her calm. He said, "Stay with your son." The other cleric opened the door only enough to speak, keeping his body between Daryl and the interior. Daryl's voice came through, sharp and too loud for a small porch. He demanded the notebook. He demanded they stop doing this in his house. He demanded they let him in. Marisol glanced at Evan, and Evan's throat tightened harder, as if the presence of Daryl itself was pulling the knot tighter. Father Kavanaugh kept his voice low, and he kept praying, still not ending, still not giving fear the closing it wanted. And Daryl, outside, kept pushing. He cursed, he threatened, he accused. The other cleric held the boundary. And in that tension, prayer held open, truth held open, a door held shut. The house seemed to gather itself, not with a roar, with a pressure, like weather building before a lightning strike. And that is where this case moved from difficult to dangerous. Because when the truth starts to open a knot that has been cinched tight by fear and secrecy, something always tries to stop you before you reach the end. Sometimes it's a demon, sometimes it's a man, sometimes it's both working the same angle. And in that Louisiana house, with a child fighting for breath on a living room rug, and a landlord pounding on the door like he could beat the truth back into hiding, the next moment would decide whether the knot stayed tied or whether it finally began to give way.